Something in the high country shifts before danger arrives. The elk feel it first, moving off the ridgeline without cause, threading through the pines in a silence that has no explanation. The horses sense it next, pressing toward the far fence with their ears laid flat and their nostrils searching the air for something the human nose will never catch. And if a man has lived long enough in the mountains, long enough to stop assuming he already knows everything the land is trying to tell him, he begins to feel it too. Not fear exactly, something quieter than fear. A pressure, the way the air thickens in the hour before a storm that hasn't shown itself yet on the horizon. Seth Harlan felt it on a Tuesday in the third week of September, standing at the edge of his property with a coffee cup going cold in his hand and his eyes fixed on the tree line above the north pasture. The pines up there were old-growth Douglas fir, thick and dark, and whatever early morning light the sky had to offer barely penetrated them before noon. He had been working this stretch of New Mexico mountain country for 4 years, long enough to know every sound the ridge made in every kind of weather. What he heard that Tuesday morning was the particular sound of a ridge that had gone deliberately quiet. The jays gave him the clearest signal. They nested along the upper slope in a dense band of fir and spruce, and on normal mornings they were loud and quarrelsome from first light until well after sunrise, their calls cutting through the cold mountain air in short, abrasive bursts. That Tuesday, they were silent. Not absent, he could see them, dark shapes on the branches, but silent in the way birds fall silent when something has moved into their space, and they have chosen, collectively, to give it no indication they know it is there. Seth drank the last of his cold coffee, set the cup on the fence rail, and went about his morning work. But he did not stop watching the ridge. By the end of that week, it had happened 5 times. Same hour, same stretch of tree line, same quality of unnatural stillness that settled over the ridge like a held breath. No movement he could identify as human. Nothing visible that a man could point to and name. But the tracks, when he finally climbed up to look on the 5th afternoon, told a different story. Moccasin prints in the soft, dark soil beneath the firs, small and deliberate, set at intervals that spoke of someone who had stopped for long periods and crouched low. A flat-topped boulder near the upper tree line had its surface lichen disturbed in the way that lichen gets disturbed when a person has been sitting on it, leaning forward for hours at a stretch. The view from that boulder was unobstructed and complete. A full sweep of Seth's cabin, his corral, his barn, the trail curving in from the southern road, the creek glinting through the willows to the east. Whoever had been up there had seen everything. He thought about that for 2 full days before deciding what to do with it. Seth was not a man who moved directly from discovery to action without the space of consideration between them, which in his experience was one of the few habits that separated the men who grew old on the frontier from the ones who didn't. There were reasons a person might watch a ranch from a distance without announcing themselves, and not all of those reasons were hostile. He had done the same thing himself more than once, studied a place or a person at length before deciding whether the approach was worth making. So he waited, he thought, and on the 6th morning, he rose an hour before first light, dressed in the dark without striking a lamp, and went up the slope through the cold pre-dawn forest long before whatever had been watching him could settle into position. He reached the boulder before sunrise and found a place behind a fallen spruce 10 feet back from it, where the shadow was deep and the deadfall gave him cover he didn't have to manufacture. He settled in with his rifle across his knees and the mountain cold pressing into the back of his collar and waited. The sky lightened in the way it does at that elevation. Slowly at first, a gray thinning at the edges, then a long, bruised purple over the eastern ridgeline, then all at once a hard, pale clarity that arrives without warning. The birds woke, jay by jay, and the ridge came back to life with sound. He had been there 40 minutes when the figure appeared. It came up from the east, moving through the pines below the boulder, with a particular quality of quiet that Seth had only ever seen in two kinds of people: experienced hunters, and those who had grown up in terrain where being heard by the wrong thing could end your life before you understood what had found you. The figure crouched, settled into position on the boulder, and turned its full attention to the ranch below. A young woman. Apache from the deerskin and beadwork and the specific posture of someone who had learned from childhood that stillness was not something you performed, it was something you became. She was perhaps 17 or 18, with dark hair tied back and a knife at her hip, and she had no idea he was there. Seth let her watch for 2 minutes. Then he stood up from behind the deadfall without trying to be quiet, letting the sound of him rising announce itself the way you clear your throat before entering a room where someone has their back to the door. She spun, and her hand went immediately to the knife handle, and they stood 12 feet apart on that cold mountain slope with the whole valley spread below them, and looked at each other in the early morning light. He held both hands visible at his sides and kept his voice level. "I'm not going to reach for anything." He waited. She didn't draw the knife, but she didn't move her hand from the handle either, and what he saw in her eyes was not the trapped fear of someone cornered, but something more deliberate. The calculation of a person who is assessing their options with a great deal of speed and a great deal of experience. She was reading him. He let her read. "You've been on this ridge for 6 mornings," he said. "Whatever you're looking for, you haven't found it yet, or you'd be gone." He gave her a moment. "I can go back down. You can keep watching, or you can tell me what it is, and maybe between us, we can move things along faster." Nothing happened for a long moment. Wind moved through the high branches. The jays had gone quiet again around the boulder. Then she said, in English that was careful and unhurried, in the way of someone who had learned it thoroughly, but handled it with precision, choosing each word the way a person selects a stone to step on when crossing a creek. "I am not watching for something on your land." She paused for half a breath. "I am watching for something near it." If this story has already gotten its hooks in you, go ahead and drop a like right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it's one of the best ways you can keep these frontier stories coming. Her name was Kaya. She told him that on the walk down the slope, not because he had asked, but because after a brief silence, she seemed to reach a decision and offered it the way you offer someone something you've been holding for a while and have finally concluded is theirs to have. He told her his. When they reached the cabin, he offered coffee, and she looked at him with an expression that was not distrust, so much as the habit of a person who had learned not to move too quickly toward anything offered freely. Then she followed him inside anyway, and he supposed that was its own kind of answer. She had been in these mountains for 12 days. She had come up from the south, following a trail that began 2 territories over. The trail left by 6 riders who had passed through an Apache encampment 3 weeks prior and left 4 people dead behind them. 2 of those people were Kaya's father and her uncle. She said this without softening it, without looking for sympathy in Seth's expression, in the flat, careful voice of someone who has had enough days to press grief into fact. Her father had been a tracker of considerable skill, a man who had been reading the country in that region since childhood, and whose knowledge of its terrain, the water sources, the passes, the seasonal movements of game, was the kind that accumulated over decades and could not be bought or taught in any school the white world had to offer. He was 63 years old and had outlasted things that would have killed younger men. He had been shot in the back at close range by the rear rider of a group he had allowed within speaking distance because the man at the front had called out in careful Spanish that they meant no harm. Seth kept his eyes on the table while she spoke and did not interrupt. The 6 riders had moved north from the canyon where the killing happened, and Kaya had followed them, alone, across 11 days of mountain country that grew colder and steeper as it pushed into New Mexico. She had not followed them out of vengeance, she said, and said it in a way that made clear she had considered vengeance and set it aside as the wrong instrument for what she needed to understand. She followed them because men did not ride weeks into difficult, unfamiliar country without a reason. Her father was dead, and the reason mattered. Understanding it was the only thing she could still do for him. What she had pieced together over those 12 days, watching the riders from ridge lines and canyon walls and the cover of creek brush, was this. The 6 men were looking for a specific piece of property. They had survey maps. They had asked questions in 2 different towns before leaving the roads behind and cutting north through rough country. The property they were navigating toward, through pine and shale and high meadow and creek, was the one Seth had been ranching for 4 years in the shallow valley below the North Ridge. They were coming to his land, and they had been camped 4 miles northeast in the bend of the upper canyon for 3 days already, waiting for something or watching for something, and she had not yet determined which. Seth set his coffee cup on the table very carefully. "Do you know what they want here?" Kaya looked at him for a long time across the table. The morning light had come fully through the cabin window by then, lying flat and pale across the floorboards, and outside the yard was quiet with that particular autumn quiet of high country where the warmth of the season is already packing to leave. She had tracked these men for 12 days. She was sitting in the cabin of a man she'd known for 30 minutes. He could see her deciding how much of the rest to give. "The man who owned this land before you," she said. "His name was Colton Reyes." Seth nodded. "Surveyor. Died 6 years ago. I bought from his estate. Before he died, Reyes came into this range to survey a mineral claim. A silver seam. It runs under the north ridge of your property." She paused. "He hired my father to guide him. My father knew every foot of this mountain. He had known about the seam for years. It surfaces near the creek above the canyon in a way you can read if you know what to look for. He showed Reyes the precise location. They spent 4 days mapping it together. My father helped him produce the survey notes that described the find in full detail." The silence in the cabin was complete. Seth didn't move. "Reyes filed the claim alone," Kaya said. "In his name only. My father's contribution was not recorded. Not in the official document." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "My father never legally challenged it. By the time men in our band who understood territorial law well enough to advise him were consulted, Reyes was already dead. The claim had passed to a businessman in Santa Fe named Alderman, who purchased Reyes's entire survey portfolio. Alderman has been working that seam for 3 years. It is, by all accounts, producing well. And the men camped in the canyon northeast of here work for a man named Voss. Alderman hired him to manage problems." Kaya's voice remained level, but something precise moved through it. "I heard the name in a town south of here, spoken by one of the riders when they thought no one nearby understood English well enough to follow. Voss is the kind of man who does not negotiate. He makes things disappear." She looked at Seth directly. "They are not here for you. They are here because of something Colton Reyes left inside this cabin before he died. Something Voss needs to destroy before anyone with legal authority finds it first. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. There's more coming from the frontier, and this story is far from finished." Seth stood and went to the window and stood there for a while looking at his land. His cabin was 14 years old, built by Reyes himself in the early years of the survey work, rough-hewn pine walls and a stone fireplace that predated even the cabin around it, hauled up the slope rock by rock from the creek. He had lived in it for 4 years and repaired it where it needed repairing and never once thought of it as a structure that might be keeping something it hadn't told him about. He turned back to the room. What did Reyes leave behind? Kaya's expression shifted slightly. Not open exactly, but less guarded in a way he was beginning to be able to read. My father received a letter from Reyes 2 years before Reyes died. In the letter, Reyes said he had spent a long time unable to live with what he had done. He was not, my father believed, a dishonest man by nature. He was a man who made a dishonest choice and found he could not set it down afterward, no matter how he tried. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. Reyes said he had drafted a formal affidavit, a sworn legal statement, acknowledging my father's role in the discovery of the seam and stating plainly that the claim should have been registered under both their names. He said he had prepared the original survey notes as well, with my father's name recorded as co-author of the findings. He could not bring himself to file them with the territorial court. He was afraid of aldermen, afraid of what challenging the claim would set in motion, but he could not destroy the documents either. So he hid them on his property, and he wrote to my father to say that they existed, and where, if the time ever came when they were needed. Alderman's people found the letter, Seth said. After my father was killed, among his belongings, Voss read it and rode north. She met his eyes steadily. The documents are still here, Mr. Harlan, somewhere in this cabin. And Voss has 6 armed men and 3 days of patience behind him already. Seth spent the rest of that morning going through his cabin with a thoroughness he had never applied to it before. He pulled furniture from walls. He examined floorboards. He checked beneath shelving and behind the stoveplate and along the window frames. Kaya sat at the table and did not help, and he understood why without having to ask. Whatever Reyes had hidden belonged to her people, and the finding of it was his part of this exchange. She had carried information across 12 days of cold mountain country, alone, following men who had already demonstrated what they were willing to do. The least he could offer in return was his own hands and his own effort. He found it in the fireplace. 4th stone from the left, along the rear wall, slightly lower than the others. The mortar around it was newer than the mortar on the stones beside it, marginally lighter in color, set with a different hand. He might have stood in front of that fireplace 1,000 times without noticing. He noticed now. He worked the stone loose with a chisel and pulled it free, and behind it, wrapped in oilskin and then in a piece of cured deer leather that had kept the moisture out for 6 years, was a tight packet of documents folded carefully and held with a strip of rawhide. He brought them to the table and set them in front of Kaya and stepped back. She opened the oilskin with hands that were careful and deliberate. Inside were 3 separate documents. The first was a set of survey notes in Reyes's cramped, precise handwriting, covering 4 pages, with 2 names recorded at the top in the same hand. Colton Reyes, and beside it, her father's name, written in full. The second was a formal letter addressed to the Territorial Land Office of New Mexico, signed and dated, attesting to the joint nature of the discovery and requesting amendment of the original claim filing. The third was personal in character, addressed to no one, written in the voice of a man putting things on paper because the weight of carrying them had finally exceeded what he could manage alone. Seth stepped outside and left her with it. He stood in the yard in the autumn cold for 10 minutes, watching the ridge to the northeast. The sky above the pines was the particular pale blue of high-altitude mornings in late September, clean and hard and very clear. He thought about Colton Reyes sitting alone in this cabin 6 years ago, pressing a packet of documents behind a stone and then mortaring it shut and walking away from it, unable to act on it and equally unable to destroy it. Choosing a third thing, the thing people sometimes choose when the 2 obvious options are both more than they can stand. Leaving the problem somewhere, it might eventually be found by someone with the will to carry it further. When Kaya came to the doorway, she was composed in the way she had been composed through all of it. But something in her face was different, lighter in some way that was hard to name. The way a mountain looks different after a sustained wind has passed through it and taken the heaviest clouds with it. "These documents," she said quietly, "if they were placed before the court, They would require a formal review of Alderman's claim at minimum, Seth said. A signed affidavit from a licensed surveyor carries legal weight in this territory. It's not a guarantee. Alderman has money and lawyers and time on his side. But it's a legitimate challenge. The right attorney in Santa Fe would know exactly what to do with this. He paused. The question is getting them there before Voss gets here. He will come today or tomorrow, Kaya said. He has been patient long enough. Seth looked at the documents in her hands and thought for a moment about the county deputy who worked the range 5 miles to the south, a man named Orrin Pratt, steady and unhurried, and the kind of lawman who asked the right questions and then listened carefully to the answers. "Ride with me," Seth said. "I know a man south of here who needs to hear this today." They were on horseback within 20 minutes, Seth's roan and a mare from the corral that Kaya took to immediately, and they rode south at a pace that covered ground without abusing the horses over the rocky terrain. Kaya said little on the ride, but she read the country continuously as they moved through it, her eyes tracking the ridgelines, noting the draws and the sight lines, cataloguing the terrain with the automatic attention of someone who has never been able to afford to stop doing it. Seth found himself doing the same, and for a while they moved through the mountain country in a shared silence that had a quality different from the silences of strangers. It was the silence of two people who were thinking about the same thing without needing to say so. Orrin Pratt listened to everything without interrupting. He was a man of 50-something with gray at his temples and a manner of absolute stillness when someone was talking to him that communicated, without words, that he was hearing every part of what was being said and nothing was going to be dismissed before he'd turned it over properly. When Seth finished, Pratt asked 4 questions. Then he stood up from his chair, told his ranch hand to ride south toward town with a written message, and saddled his own horse. They were back at Seth's property by mid-afternoon with Pratt and 2 men from a neighboring spread who had been deputized on similar short notice before and knew what the arrangement required. Voss came down from the northeast in the early afternoon, which was sooner than Seth had expected, and told him that the man's patience had indeed run its course. He rode in front of 5 others, 6 riders total, arranged in a loose configuration that was not quite a formation, but was close enough to function as one if it needed to. He was lean and somewhere in his middle 40s, with a flat, professional manner that Seth recognized immediately. The manner of a man who did this kind of work with regularity and found it unremarkable. He stopped at Seth's gate and called out in a civil tone that he'd like to speak with the property owner about some materials belonging to the estate of the previous occupant. Seth came out onto the porch. His hands were at his sides, and he did not have his rifle with him, which he had considered for some time before deciding against. Pratt was inside the cabin. 2 deputized men were behind the barn. Kaya was nowhere visible, which meant she was somewhere Seth couldn't identify, which under the circumstances he found reassuring. "We represent the interests of a land-holding company operating out of Santa Fe," Voss said from the gate. His voice was measured and patient. "There are survey documents and personal effects belonging to the late Colton Reyes that may have been left on this property when the estate was settled. We'd like to come in and look around." "The estate was settled 6 years ago," Seth said. "I bought this property clean. Whatever was here at the time of sale belonged to the new owner." "That's a matter of some legal complexity," Voss said, "that our company's attorneys are prepared to address. We'd simply like a look around first, informally." His eyes moved across the yard with the quiet efficiency of a man taking inventory. "Save everyone a good deal of trouble. Deputy Orrin Pratt is inside my cabin," Seth said. "He rode out this morning after I sent word that 6 armed men were camped without authorization in the creek canyon 4 miles northeast of my property. The men from town should arrive within the hour." He gave that a moment to settle. "Whatever it was you came here to find, it isn't here." and you're currently standing at the gate of a property with a county deputy inside it and 2 witnesses behind that barn, having identified yourself as the agent of a company whose hired men killed an Apache man and his kinsman 3 weeks south of here." Seth kept his voice as level as Voss had kept his. "I'd ride back to Santa Fe and have your attorneys address that legal complexity before it gets considerably more complicated." Voss held very still for a long moment. It was the stillness of a man running calculations, of someone who arrived at a place with a plan and is encountering the specific situation that the plan did not account for. His eyes moved from Seth to the cabin window where Pratt had appeared, and then to the barn, and then to the tree line above the north pasture, where there was nothing visible and nothing moving. Then, without a word, he turned his horse. His 5 men turned with him. They rode back up the northeastern trail in the same loose configuration they had arrived in, and the sound of their horses faded through the pines until there was nothing left of it but the ordinary sounds of the mountain. Pratt came out onto the porch and stood beside Seth, and they watched the trail for a long time. Then Pratt said, without looking away from the tree line, "They'll try the legal route now." Seth said, "Let them." Pratt nodded slowly. "The documents are the right answer. They're in the record now. Alderman's lawyers can maneuver around that for a long time, but they can't make a signed affidavit from a licensed surveyor disappear from the territorial filing office." He paused. "It'll take time." Seth said, "Most things worth doing do." What happened in the months that followed was slow and procedural in the way that legal things are, which is to say, it was not dramatic and did not resolve itself in any single afternoon, but moved through the territorial court system the way water moves through limestone, steadily, patiently, finding the passages that exist rather than the ones you wish were there. The attorney in Santa Fe who took the case was a careful man named Guadalupe Reyna, who had spent 30 years watching territorial land claims change hands in ways that did not always survive scrutiny. He knew precisely what Reyes's affidavit was worth and precisely how to place it in front of the people who needed to see it. Alderman's company hired 3 lawyers. Reyna hired 1 more and waited. Voss was arrested in November on a warrant that Pratt had wired ahead for, based on statements from Kaya and from 2 Apache men who had witnessed the incident at the canyon camp. 2 of his riders were arrested with him. The others had crossed into another territory and kept going, which Pratt said was the most sensible thing they had done in a long time. Kaya left the morning after Voss rode away from the gate when the first true frost of the season had lain overnight across the north pasture, and the grass was silver and stiff in the early cold. She came to the fence at first light, and Seth was already there, because he was the kind of man who tended to be at the edge of his property when something was about to leave it, preferring to meet a departure rather than discover it after the fact. She was carrying the oilskin packet secured inside her blanket, prepared to take it south herself to the men in her band who understood territorial law and would know how to work with Reyna and the documents. They had spoken the night before about what the legal process might accomplish, about the realistic distance between a filed affidavit and actual legal recognition of her father's claim, about the years it would likely take, about the things that could go wrong and the things that could go right. Neither of them had pretended the road was short, but the road existed now. It had not existed the week before. "Your father's name is in the record," Seth said. "Whatever else happens from here, it's there permanently." Kaya looked at him for a moment in the cold morning light, and then she said something that stayed with him for a long time after she was gone. Not because it was delivered with any drama, but because it landed with the specific weight of a thing that is simply, plainly true. "My father used to say the land holds the account even when the people who are supposed to hold it forget," she said. "He believed that. He spent his whole life acting on it." She looked out at the ranch, The fence line, the barn, the slope of the north ridge dark with fur in the early light. He would have been glad to know someone found it. She turned and went up the slope through the frost-pale grass and disappeared into the tree line, and the ordinary sounds of the mountain returned around the space she left in it. Seth stood at his fence for a while after she had gone. The jays were back on the ridge, loud and quarrelsome, and the horses had come to the near fence looking for their morning feed, and the day was arranging itself in front of him the way days do regardless of what the days before them contained. He thought about Colton Reyes in this cabin 6 years ago, pressing those documents behind a fireplace stone and then walking away from them, not brave enough to file them and not ruthless enough to destroy them, choosing a third thing instead. Leaving the account somewhere it might eventually find the hands of someone willing to carry it forward. He had not known, when he bought this land, that it was holding anything. Most land out here was, if a person looked closely enough and paid the right kind of attention. The frontier had a way of absorbing everything that happened on it without advertising what it had taken in. The promises broken, the records falsified, the quiet acts of decency performed in the presence of no witnesses and no reward. What changed things was not the land holding its account, it was someone being willing to sit on a cold ridge for 6 mornings, watching and waiting until she had read enough of a man's character to decide he was worth trusting with the truth. Seth walked back to the cabin. He made fresh coffee and stood at the window and drank it while it was still hot for once, watching the mountain in the morning light. Outside his gate, where the trail came in from the south and curved around toward the corral, he had hung a small carved token that Kaya had pressed into his hand before leaving. A piece of worked juniper root, marked in a way he didn't have words for, but understood the meaning of well enough. Her people would know what it signified when they passed this stretch of country. This is a place it is safe to approach. This is someone who can be trusted with the truth. He thought that was about as good a thing as a man could have hanging on his gate in a part of the world where trust was not easily given and not lightly held. He finished his coffee. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and the morning was already warming, and the cattle in the lower pasture needed attention, and the fence on the east side had been needing a post replaced for 2 weeks. He set the cup down and pulled on his coat and went out into the clear September morning to take care of it. Tell us in the comments, if you had been in Seth's place and a stranger told you there were armed men coming for something hidden inside your own walls, would you have ridden for help or tried to handle it alone? Leave your answer below, and if this story earned a place in your afternoon, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more frontier stories coming, each one carrying something worth sitting with for a while. We'll see you at the next one.